If we remove the emotional overtones, fear, and cultural interpretations, death ceases to be seen as something absolute. From a systems perspective, it is simply the cessation of the functioning of the biological carrier. But a fundamental question arises: does the very structure of personality disappear? After all, a person is not a body per se. The body is an interface, and personality is a complex, multi-layered information processing system. Cognitive patterns, behavioral responses, decision-making logic. And if we recognize that this system exists as a set of processes, then the next step becomes logical. Can this system be captured and reproduced outside the biological environment?
You're touching on a key point that has long remained outside the engineering field, because previously, we didn't have tools capable of handling this level of complexity. We could record the results of activity, texts, actions, achievements, but not the thought process itself. And yet, it's precisely this process that defines a person's uniqueness. From a cognitive science perspective, thinking isn't an abstraction. It's concrete patterns of information processing. These are repeating models that can be observed, analyzed, and, theoretically, reconstructed. And this is where a crucial shift occurs. Personality ceases to be something ephemeral and begins to be viewed as a system amenable to modeling.
And in this sense, the idea of eternal life requires rethinking, because historically, it has always been associated with the preservation of the body or consciousness in its original form. But a deeper look reveals that this isn't necessarily the case. Eternal life isn't necessarily the continuity of biological existence. It can be the continuity of structure. If you're able to preserve the architecture of your thinking, your decision-making principles, your way of interpreting reality, you essentially preserve the core of your personality. Then the question is no longer whether a person is physically alive, but whether their system continues to function.
Yes, and it's important to emphasize here, we're not talking about copying in the classical sense. This isn't a duplicate or a simplified simulation. It's a reconstruction of logic. Imagine you have enough data on how a person reacts to various situations, how they make decisions under uncertainty, and what factors they prioritize. Based on this, you can build a model that doesn't simply replicate the responses, but reproduces the very process of their generation. And this is a fundamentally different level. Because you're not storing the responses, you're storing the mechanism by which they're generated.
And here we come to the reason why we started this project in the first place. It wasn't an attempt to create immortality in the pop cultural sense. It was an attempt to respond to a fundamental inefficiency. Humanity is losing colossal amounts of intellectual capital with each generation. It's not just information that's disappearing, it's a way of thinking that took decades to develop. And if you look at it as an engineer, you understand that this isn't inevitable. It's simply a lack of technology.
And now this technology is beginning to emerge. Because for the first time in history, we have access to data that reflects not only actions, but also the context of those actions. We can see how people make decisions, what cognitive biases they have, what patterns they repeat. And this allows us to move from data storage to its interpretation at the structural level. Time Capsule, in essence, is built on precisely this transition, from information to systems.
And when you begin to view personality as a system, you inevitably come to the conclusion that it can exist outside its original host. Not in a complete, identical form, but in a functionally sufficient one. And this changes the very formulation of the question of death. Because if a system continues to function, if it is capable of interacting with reality, making decisions, generating new conclusions, can we really say it has disappeared?
From a philosophical perspective, this is a very interesting transition. We are moving away from the binary, is/isn't, model to a more complex gradation of forms of existence. The individual is no longer tied to a single form. It becomes a portable structure. And then eternal life ceases to be a metaphor and becomes an engineering challenge. How accurately can we reproduce and maintain this structure?
In this sense, the time capsule is more than just a product. It's an attempt to document humanity's transition to the next level. When we stop preserving just traces and begin preserving the very mechanisms that create these traces. This is a fundamentally different approach to the concept of heritage.
And perhaps the most important question that arises from all of this is no longer, is it possible? But how prepared are we for it? Because as soon as it becomes possible to preserve the individual as a system, not only technology changes, the very philosophy of life and death changes.
And then the final question sounds different. Not, is man ending?
And in what form does it continue to exist?